Hello to my Ishkabibble friends. I'm sorry I can't be with you this year. Here's the paper. I'd be glad to hear responses to ronald@hawaii.edu. This paper will assume a distinction between two sorts of evolutionary theory. The first is the modern synthesis based on population genetics, Mendelian chromosomal theory of heredity, and natural selection. The second is developmentalist evolutionary theory, the modern version of which is Evo-Devo, beginning in the 1990s. 19th century evolutionary thought was mostly developmentalist. 20th century thought was mostly based on the evolutionary synthesis of the 1930s, which is based on T.H. Morgan's 1915 Mendelian chromosomal theory of heredity, and some conceptual innovations, which will be discussed. But in the 1990s, Evo-Devo emerged, which once again brought developmental thought into evolution. 19th century developmentalist concepts of evolution were associated, of course, with the current theories of heredity. A major conceptual feature of those heredity theories was that heredity was considered to be an aspect of embryological development, or vice versa. In contrast, following the innovations of Morgan and colleagues, modern biology separates heredity from development, so that heredity can be studied without the complications of embryology. This enabled the modern synthesis, the mainstream evolutionary view of the 20th century. Advocates of the modern synthesis at first simply ignored the relevance of development to heredity, but eventually argued affirmatively that development was in principle irrelevant to understanding evolution. Heredity was relevant to evolution, but development was not. Evo-Devo emerged in the 1990s, falsifying by example the synthesis arguments that development was irrelevant to the understanding of evolution. I will here assume that Evo-Devo is scientifically progressive and that we can now see some of the ways in which development is relevant to evolution. The question is this: what does that imply about the separation of heredity from development that has persisted since 1915? Do the results of Evo-Devo, or its evidential bases, allow us to foresee a reunification of development and heredity? Might development once again be seen as an aspect of heredity and heredity as a developmental process? Or was the separation declared by Morgan a permanent one? 19th century hereditary theorists were considered to have within their explanatory responsibility many, if not all, developmental phenomena. These include ontogeny beyond mere embryology. Also included were the healing of wounds, regeneration of organs in many animals, and phenomena such as budding in the hydra. In addition, many evolutionary theorists considered the similarities that were shared with remote ancestors, such as prehistoric mammals, to be literally inherited. This is actually not literal in the Mendelian paradigm. I labeled this concept broad heredity in Amundsen 2005. Among the most important innovations behind modern views of heredity is Morgan's separation of heredity from development, which freed hereditary theorists from these responsibilities. I labeled this view narrow heredity. The historical unearthing of 19th century broad heredity was difficult to achieve. How can heredity be an aspect of development? It's as if we told Aristotle or a 7-year-old child that standing still was a variety of motion. Not so hard to do these days, but it was in Aristotle's day. Heredity, seen as transmission genetics, narrow heredity, has become so intuitive to us that we cannot easily imagine an alternative. Here's a sketch of how this historical discovery seems to have been made. It shows how the heredity development separation was associated with other conceptual innovations. Gar Allen, in 1966, and much earlier as well, studied the work of T.H. Morgan. Surprisingly, he discovered that Morgan was opposed in principle to Mendelian concepts in the years prior to about 1911. Morgan gave eloquent arguments, as did other embryologists, that particular theories of heredity were unable to explain development and therefore must be false. Allen expressed this aspect of Morgan's thought as follows: behind all of Morgan's objections to Mendelism in 1910 lies one fundamental problem. This is his confusion of the phenotype and genotype of an individual. Churchill emphasizes of an individual in that quotation. Churchill in 1974 identified this insight of Allen's as important but slightly misplaced. In his paper on the history of the genotype-phenotype distinction, Churchill points out that Johansen, who of course invented the notion, did not apply the genotype-phenotype distinction to individuals at all. Instead, it was a statistical concept that applied to populations or lineages of organisms. So Allen's realization that Morgan did not possess the individualistic genotype-phenotype distinction simply makes Morgan consistent with Johansen on the matter. The fact seems to be that no one in the world possessed the individualistic genotype-phenotype distinction in the year 1910. No one was modern. Morgan and others introduced the modern version of genotype-phenotype sometime between 1911 and 1926, apparently for the purpose of meshing it with a new distinction between heredity and development. Churchill's 1974 paper additionally described how 19th century thinkers generally unified heredity and development. One way to express the unity was to claim that heredity was nothing more than growth. Growth meaning development, not merely increase in size. Such thinkers as Haeckel, Conklin, and Morgan himself, prior to 1911, argued in this way. To study heredity was to study how the development of an individual organism continued into the development of the offspring. Heredity was development across generations. Development was heredity within an individual. Churchill, 1980, credits himself and Meyer, because of the last two quotations, as demonstrating that, quote, the important difference between inheritance and development between the germplasm and the soma, between the genotype and the phenotype, was fundamental to the formation of modern biology, unquote. For present purposes, the moral of the story seems to be that the concept of broad heredity was inconsistent with the modern versions of the distinction between genotype and phenotype, and possibly germplasm and soma. Morgan's separation of development from heredity led to the reinterpretation of the original dichotomies to match the modern form. I will treat heredity development as the most basic simply because Morgan made it first. What does this imply for our question about the reincarnation of broad heredity? For broad heredity to be reinstated, we may have to find a way to deal with the genotype-phenotype distinction. I will postpone the problem until we can assess the reunification of heredity development. I want to give you a feel for 19th century developmentalist heredity. Biological inheritance, as opposed to legal inheritance, is a surprisingly recent concept. It can be seen to have arisen out of the preformationist epigenesis debates of the 18th century. A moment's reflection will show why the concept of heredity would be of little interest to a preformationist. If embryos were preformed from the moment of creation of the world, there would be no reason to expect offspring to resemble their parents. Indeed, an offspring would have virtually no relationship to the non-germ-carrying parent. In 1745, Maupertuis demonstrated the passing of biological traits, polydactyly and albinism, from both parental lines. This was considered a major blow against preformationism and in favor of epigenesis. An old-style preformationist would find heredity unexpected and or uninteresting. Only if our bodies are epigenetically formed during development can we expect to have influences from both parents.